This is where we left off on part one with regard to um, populations having a barrier. Uh, Depending on geography, if they can't come near each other, they're not going to be able to reproduce, even if all the other factors are met. Um, they also may evolve independently via the topics that we've talked about in previous chapters through mutation, natural selection, and also genetic drift. So we aren't excluding that. We're just adding a couple of more variables with regard to what has gone into the billions and billions of years and the different species that we identify. Just an FYI, it is in your book and it's kind of interesting, is just regions with a lot of geographic barriers, we find typically have more species than regions without all of these barriers. And the image at the top is fictitious. There really isn't any portion of a coast that has all of this, but what you have are these various things sticking out. So you have a lagoon, you have a bay, you have a tide island, so an island that there is a land, a mass that is all the way back to the major land mass. You have this barrier island. You have an isthmus, a small area where there's land. All of these can lead to little geographic isolation of populations. So that's why we see all of these in areas like this, like our Chesapeake Bay, where you have these inlets, a great variety of species. And it's another reason why it's so important to actually try to protect these areas, because that's where there is so much variety when it comes to species. The isolation clearly decreases between population if the distance decreases, but if the distance increases, then the isolation is going to increase. That's a pretty obvious thing. Then we have an example of salamanders here who live further apart, live pretty far apart. Also, these barriers can be intrinsic, where it's not a biological barrier, but sympatric barriers. The the speciation takes place geographically in overlapping populations, but this can be because different in a timeline, different populations took advantage of certain food sources, took advantage of areas where there was less predation, took advantage of areas where the nesting was better, etc. So something was advantageous in that area, and they continued to adapt to make sure that they were the most adaptable species for that area. So you have back to Darwin's finches and the variety of beaks. These beaks are so evolved to make sure to evolve for the foods that they eat. So you have none of those barriers, those allopathic barriers, or the allopatric barriers. Sorry, I was thinking of healthcare. Allopatric barriers take place, but there still has this separation of species based on some other factor. Polyploidy is something that can take place in any species, but in animal species, and this is the presence of extra chromosomes, it tends to lead to a non-viable zygote. So it tends to lead to there is no offspring. But in plants, it happens pretty often. You don't have, this image isn't from your book, but you have the strawberry on the left that is shaped like this, and everybody's probably seen a strawberry like this because of the presence of extra chromosomes. And then you have a normal strawberry. And it's not only is it common in plants, It's very much used in most of our food sources, like corn and wheat and barley, where you have multiple chromosomes. This can be an accident. It can also be because of hybridization. And you have also autopolyploid is an individual with two chromosome sets. And then this can also be done where you have the chromosomes from different species. And this can also be because this can be being done in the lab to try to introduce chromosome sets that make a particular plant resistant to a disease or a maybe resistant to certain, or not taste as well to certain insects. You have different examples of habitat differentization. And this one is the maggot fly. The maggot fly was native to hawthorn trees. Not hawthorn trees were native to this area, to this country. And then what they've done is they've adapted to apple trees. Apple trees were introduced to this country with the first settlers. And so over the hundreds of years, the maggot flies have adapted and are now seen on hawthorn trees and apple trees. And they are so different, the ones that are on the hawthorn trees and the apple trees, that we consider them different species of maggot flies. And so we find this speciation due to new niches that are constantly being created. There can also be sexual selection can drive sympatric speciation. And what you have are these fish, this cichlid fish in Lake Victoria that tend to mate based on color, but in a science experiment, the female fish were put in a environment where the monochromatic light, the orange light, so the color wasn't distinguishable. And they did find that they mated with the fish that were monochromatic, and it did create at least phylogenetically, so in looks, a different species. Hybrid zones, so there are zones where you have overlap. Then there are factors that can cause reproductive isolation. A hybrid zone is a region where members of different species mate and produce hybrids. I think one of the hybrids that your book shows is a growler bear, where you have the image of a polar bear and a grizzly bear that have mated. Polars and grizzly bears sometimes do come in contact with each other, not particularly very often, and you do have that hybrid zone where you do have that hybridization. Where you have incomplete reproductive barriers. That can happen in a single band, or it can happen in a double-banded hybridization, where we have this image of the toads, and you have the idea that there is a hybridization going both sides of that zone. Generally, hybrids, as we talked about before, have reduced fitness compared to the parent species, because think of it, both parents are highly adaptable to their particular environment. Now you have an environment that's a mix of the two, that hybrid zone, so of course they're going to be somewhat reduced to their compared to their parents. That's what we're talking about, reduced fitness. If there is three general outcomes, three possible outcomes that we have seen in science, and that is a reinforcement in terms of hybridization, fusion, or stability. With regard to reinforcement, and generally reinforcement and fusion are kind of a 50-50 whether the hybrid will be less fit or more fit. So with reinforcement, what you have is you have kind of a middle path, and so you see the image at the bottom, and then at where the two different species diverge, you have a third one coming down the middle. With regard to fusion, you have the two species diverging and then coming back together on the other side, and then you have stability where you have kind of a blending of the two different types. So let's look at it a little bit closer. With fusion, not as fit as the parents. There can be substantial gene flow between the species, and if it's great enough, it can fuse, the gene flow can fuse into a single species if the gene flow is great enough. And we do see this with the fish in Lake Victoria, cichlids, to distinguish males from a different species. At the top you have two different species of these fish, one with more orange at the top and one at blue at the top, and then you have a nice very much of a mix of the two in the fusion at the bottom. So fusion may cause a new species. Stability, the third of the three, and of these three possibilities, is where the hybrid zone can overwhelm or increase reproductive isolation inside the hybrid zone, and you have a continued formation of hybrid individuals that basically they become their own species. Speciation can occur in basically two rates. It can very slowly or rapidly. The one that Darwin thought was happening was the slow speciation, changes over many eons, so millions of years. So it can be gradual pattern in terms of speciation, that would be the slow, or it can be a punctuated pattern. With the punctuated pattern, the thought is that some major event happens, maybe a bottleneck effect or maybe a founder effect, where a whole new species is fast-tracked into existence. And so something happens in the punctuated. In the gradual, it's just over time the species is adapting to the environment. In terms of studying this this concept of speciation and the gradual or punctuated, of course we have to use fossils. And fossil records or morphological data. So go back and think of the slide where you had the human arm and hand, bat arm and hand, and the whale arm and hand. So studying that change, or it can be done on a molecular level. Molecular level looks at the change generally of RNA and how that has changed over time. In terms of fossil records, that we do find that species that appear suddenly persist, essentially that species that appear suddenly persist essentially unchanged over some time and then apparently disappear. So you do have the appearance and disappearance of species. Think of something like the dinosaur, etc. And then it's these two gentlemen, Niles Eldredge and particularly Stephen Jay Gould, who has written numerous books about evolution and has done a great amount to bring it to the idea of the layman person, coined the term punctuated equilibria to describe appearance of sudden change. Punctuated equilibrium model contrasts with the gradual change of species. And you do see that image in terms of with the punctuated, where you have some sort of species and then a rapid change and then turning into a different species. We'll pick this up on the next one.